Chair. Tēnā koutou whare, tēnā koutou e honga. The previous speaker mentioned the government's draft New Zealand energy strategy, and I thought I might begin with that point also. Perhaps unkindly criticised by the New Zealand Herald, who talks about its lack of detail and content. Probably they've not understood that it's one of those aspirational strategies that talks in a hand-wavy kind of way about goals without actually including any content about how we might achieve those goals. I want to talk about two of the gaps. One of those is that this is a draft strategy that says nothing about energy planning. It says nothing about how much energy and where we need it and when. The other gap that I want to talk about is that it says nothing about the necessary and now urgent reform that we require in electricity generation, and in particular in the decision-making about electricity generation. Mr. Chair, I think it was Shakespeare who said that there's a tide in the affairs of men, and I think we'd agree, probably at least in our party, and I'm sure others around the House would agree, that perhaps the tide has now completely gone out on the idea that decisions about essential infrastructure for New Zealand can be left to the free market. And yet here we have in electricity generation kind of the flotsam and jetsam of that sort of free market zeal of the 80s and 90s that actually is still dominating this part of the energy sector. In my portfolios, Mr. Chair, I talk to a lot of communities around the country about electricity issues, and I come across two things. I come across communities with really great ideas about electricity generation that cannot get those off the ground, and I come across electricity generation ideas from the big power companies that are steadfastly opposed by communities. So there's two different problems there. Most people support the idea that we ought to, in electricity generation, be making decisions from the perspective of the public good. They think, OK, let's know how much electricity we need, let's identify all of the options for generating that electricity, and let's compare the advantages and disadvantages of each from the point of view of the public good. And so they're kind of astonished to learn that what we actually do bears no resemblance at all to that. That instead we have no plan for how much energy is needed and where. Instead we have only those proposals from the big companies that get advanced into the resource consent decision-making process. That there's a first-come, first-served basis for that decision-making, and that there is no ability to compare schemes, because this is all counterintuitive. None of that is what we would do if we were approaching electricity generation from the public good perspective. It's a process, sir, that is virtually guaranteed to produce suboptimal outcomes. It's never going to result in conservation schemes to match supply and demand. It's never going to result in the small-scale distributed generation that's almost certainly the best option for New Zealand. Now, by chance, Mr. Chair, the public does have the opportunity to compare two schemes on the west coast of the South Island. Either one of these schemes would be sufficient to produce self-sufficiency for the west coast. There's a scheme promoted by Hydro Developments Limited that would take the acid-polluted water from the Stockton Plateau, drop it to sea level, discharge it out to sea, and would have a net positive environmental impact. On the other hand, and I should say the HDL scheme is being opposed in the Environment Court by two state-owned enterprises, Meridian and Solid Energy. And both of those companies seem to have pretty spurious reasons for opposing. And one is inclined instead to suspect that it may be to do rather with their interest in their own generation schemes. That's both scandalous and unethical behaviour on the part of state-owned enterprises. Meridian's scheme, by way of contrast, would flood 300 hectares of pristine public conservation land, the largest inundation of conservation land ever in New Zealand history. And so it exemplifies the value set that we see again and again. Chair.
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr.